Hey everybody, welcome to week 3. This week we're going to be continuing our discussion of language and storytelling that we began last week via Toni Morrison's Nobel lecture, which rewards repeated rereadings and provides some really rich stuff for discussion. I was pleased with many of the things that you were discussing last week in terms of Morrison's Nobel lecture and what she says about language and its power and influence in our lives, because that's really the basis of the course of what we'll be discussing throughout the entire semester, the big idea that we'll be exploring. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that, about the course's big idea, language and the human experience, which gravitates around the question: what role does language play in shaping our species on the level of individual and group identity, relationships, communities, environments, knowledge, etc.? Because language is central to everything that we do as human beings. And we're going to be exploring this idea through the lens of 3 different groups of writers and thinkers. Now, um, we're going to be doing it through the lens of story makers, scholars, and scientists, as I've pointed out here. Now, when we're talking about story makers, I'm thinking of people like Morrison, those who tell stories for a living, those who make stories. Stories are central to really all that we do. Our lives, I don't know what our lives would be without stories. I mean, just think about that for a minute. When was the last time you told a story? Often when things happen, what's the first thing you do when you get home, or you meet up with your friends again or your family? You want to tell a story about it. Stories, they're again central to all that we do. They're one of the top 3 industries in the world. You've got the food industry, shelter industry, and the story making industry, which includes, we've got movies, you've got books, you've got music, TV shows, so many different things that we invest our life, well, that we invest in terms of stories. It's central to everything that we do, even including video games. So many different aspects of our life are bound up in stories. Without stories, I don't know what we would be as a species. So, in terms of story makers, we'll be exploring this in terms of what people who write stories for a living, people who tell stories for a living, what they have to say about the significance of stories and of language. Because I think one of the first places where we would want to go if we're looking for expertise in language is people who are crafting new worlds from those stories every day. And that's what really is happening when we tell stories. We're crafting a new world. We're creating something new. Same thing that happens when we begin the story once upon a time. It takes us into a distant place. Something other, it encourages us to think about something other than here and now concerns. So we'll be continuing our discussion of stories that we began via Toni Morrison, and we'll look at what other story makers have said in stories about language. We'll continue with that this week, actually. We'll also be, after we finish with our story makers unit, we'll invest some time in looking at what different scholars have suggested about language, about its significance in our lives. And by scholars, I'm thinking of people who study literature. They write about literature and language for a living. So we'll be looking at language again through the lens of scholars, those who study language as their life's work. And then we'll also be considering it in terms of scientists, what scientists have said about language and its significance in our species. And by scientists, I'm thinking of people who deal with the brain. So we have neuroscientists, and as well as other anthropologists, people who, and linguists, people who observe language in action in other cultures and then write and think about it. So these are the 3 main groups that we'll be looking at in terms of language and the human experience, to sort of pinpoint these different ideas, to look at the ongoing conversations surrounding the significance of language in our lives and in our species. So I just wanted to point that out, and then to also point out that our first unit will be centered around story makers, beginning with Toni Morrison. Now, as we go through each of these different works that we'll be reading through this semester, I want you to keep note of the main points that each of these writers are saying in their work, because when it comes to our major assignment for the semester, the signature assignment for the course, which is a literature review, it will be based around the ideas we discuss from story makers, scholars, scientists. So we'll talk more about that a little in a few weeks down the road, but I just want you to keep your eye out and to make note of the main points that each of the writers that we will be discussing, of the main points of what they have to say, because that will benefit you when we begin the signature assignment for the semester, which will include summarizing and discussing what each of these writers have said in your literature review. So keep your eye out for that. Now, for this week, the story makers whose work we will be discussing include Gloria Anzaldúa and Edith Cunha. Gloria Anzaldúa is, I believe, Mexican American, or actually Mexican and Hispanic, and Edith Cunha is from Portugal, I believe, and so we'll be exploring what each of them have to say in their stories. One by Anzaldúa, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, and the other, Edith Cunha, titled Talking in a New Land. Now, How to Tame a Wild Tongue, it takes a very different narrative structure than your typical thesis-driven structure. You got the 5-paragraph essay where you start off with what you want to say, then you give your 3 main points, and then you come back at the conclusion. All right, this is what I've told you. Anzaldúa's essay does not do that. It's very circular, and it takes a central idea and it explores that through various stories and modes of discourse. By modes of discourse, I mean different ways of writing. She writes through personal experience. She brings in some scholarship. She brings in academic writing. She brings in memoir, poetry, many different things. And it all circles around the idea that language is bound up in our identities. It's central to informing who we are. So pay attention to that as you read Anzaldúa's text. That it's not your typical text, and it might throw you off a little as you approach it, especially also because she uses multiple languages throughout the essay. So pay attention to how you're responding as you read through that essay. And do the same thing when you read Cunha's Talking in a New Land, which is more narrative-based. It's more of a story, but it has some significant things to say about the relationship between language and identity and belonging. So those are the things that we'll be reading this week and also discussing in our discussions. We have one discussion that's based around Anzaldúa's How to Tame a Wild Tongue. The other one is based around Edith Cunha's Talking in a New Land. So you can look at those ideas and then contribute to the discussion throughout the week. And then by week's end, complete the reflection. And that's how we'll be moving forward for this week. I think that's all that I have to say to you for now. I will be posting a video later regarding some ideas from Toni Morrison's Nobel lecture about unyielding and life-sustaining language. I wanted to point out some things there that came up during the course of the discussion last week, which again I thought was really good. You're all, I think, thinking about these ideas, and I want to encourage you to continue that and also to push yourselves to think deeply about the things that we're reading and discussing together. So that's all I've got for you now. If you have questions, please do feel free to let me know. My inbox is always open.